Okay, so this is the video analysis for Seamus Heaney's personal Helicon for the CAS Study of Poetry 1900s to Present, Robert Frost and Seamus Heaney Anthology. So the themes that this could possibly fall under are childhood experiences, self-discovery and poetic inspiration. Contextual information that you will need to know. This reflects on Heaney's rural upbringing on his father's farm in County Derry. The poem looks back to his childhood and relates his liking for work as a child with his working poems as an adult. The title suggests that the poem will explore the more personal sources of inspiration, and it's also a topical allusion to a mountain in Greek mythology on which there were two springs that gave inspiration for art and poetry. Heaney's childhood wells, when we start to read the poem, reflect that his rural upbringing and the experience of the wells act as his inspiration, a place where poetry can progress. The fable of Narcissus, which I'm sure you've heard of before, also took place here. Where Narcissus fell in love with his own reflection, and when he realised he couldn't have the object of his desire, he ended his life. He drowned himself, okay? And that's where daffodils get the name Narcissus from, or Narcissi. Then you have this dedication as well that's really interesting for Michael Longley. So this was a poet who was part of a group with Heaney. They met on a weekly basis to read and discuss each other's work during his university years at Queen's. Commentary on the structure. The three mid-stanzas are important because number 1 reveals that Heaney sought reflection, self-discovery and foreshadows his motivations for writing, to see myself. 2 gives his situation and opportunities to reflect in a nostalgic fashion. So the 3 mid-stanzas are important. Now, the rhyme scheme, there's an alternating rhyme scheme, A, B, with the use of half rhymes scattered throughout, reflecting the alternation between childhood and adulthood. The wells we see allowed for personal reflection in youth, as poetry does so in adulthood. So hopefully you can see here that the first stanza that's in the middle is the one that refers to Heaney seeking reflection and self-discovery, and then the other 2 give his situation and opportunities, reflecting in a nostalgic fashion. Now, line by line analysis. As a child, they could not keep me from wells, so it's a retrospective retelling, a reference to the childhood, and he clarifies that he is currently an adult. You can see that there's a really common farmyard scene here, perceived by the perspective of the small boy. However, it's imbued with the hindsight of a man because he's looking back on his past and reminiscing about his childhood. You can see hopefully as well that there's the alliterative as-a. There's heavy use of assonance throughout, and the assonance is meant to echo the sound of the well. The personal pronoun reveals the personal aspect of the subject and his fascination, and it shows that this is symbolic of his life. He wishes to explore its depths. Could not keep me from well. So the use of me is important because it emphasises how personal this journey really is. There's this kind of us versus them mentality as well. You've got they and then you've got me. So you've got that distancing pronoun implying the tension that childhood activities are sometimes rejected by the adult world. You can see that Heaney throughout this poem emphasises his sense of words and childhood curiosity, the natural world to search and explore, and this is probably most commonly done through alliteration and consonants and assonance. Then if we look at old pumps with buckets and windlasses, again you can see really rural vocabulary. You've got really simple adjectives which pinpoint the childlike, simple language. So it would be really important for you to, at this point, note the fact that childlike diction, through that adjective, creates this idea that it is from the reflection of, or the reflective perspective of a child. And we get this vivid sense of Heaney's childhood through the grotesque imagery that's created through "I loved the dark drop, the trapped sky, the smell of waterweed, fungus and dank moss." You'll also notice the alliterative dark drop as well, and the kind of sinister sound that makes. You'll hopefully also notice the assonance, the repeated U sound in pumps with buckets and windlasses. The assonance reinforcing the introspective, reflective tone. Pumps, buckets and windlasses are all implements that connect him to the deep world that he seeks, and it's very similar to Frost's For Once Then Something, especially with that idea of self-discovery and the shared symbol of wells as well. The use of the verb trapped suggests that something so expansive like the sky can be contained, and there's a kind of childlike wonder there as well. Then you've got the dark drops, the smells, use of synesthesia, synesthesia, which is an attempting to link the senses. So you've got that linkage between the senses. There's the frequent use of caesura throughout, with the use of all of the commas, showing the pace is quite slow, and emphasising that through this slow pace he's relishing in the sensory pleasure of his childhood. This is perhaps also shown through listing. You've got the use of the rule of three, pumps, buckets and windlasses. So that rule of three probably again conveys that he's relishing this pleasure, this reflection and nostalgia. We can also see that this is what inspires him to discover his desire to write poetry, this love of the senses and the sensory overload that we see here. Also, windlasses, just for those of you who maybe aren't aware, are used to lift buckets. So again, very rural vocabulary. You can see as well that there's a further use of rule of three in waterweed, fungus and dank moss, but this time it's that grotesque imagery. The verb choice is interesting as well, and it locates Heaney's memories in his rural upbringing. Rich sensory imagery the whole way throughout that shows he enjoys the sensory pleasure of being around and interacting with the wells. Then if we look at the second stanza, one in a brickyard with a rotted board top. So stanza 2 shifts into Heaney's vivid childhood memories about particular wells. It's no longer generalised. Then we've got the really beautiful verb choice savoured, which again shows that he's relishing this. And then you've got the onomatopoeic crash as well, again emphasising the sensory imagery throughout. And you've got the really strong verb choice plummeted, which kind of connotes a sense of violence, but also the depth of the well. And I think that's what he really wants you to take away from this, that there's a depth to this well that suggests that it needs to be explored. The knowledge that there is depth and possibility of discovery brings joy to Heaney. Then if you look at so deep, you can see that this well becomes a symbol for endless inspiration and knowledge. The emphasis of this well is on its depth, reflecting Heaney's desire to explore and search for hidden meaning. He is unable to, as of yet, ascertain what lies at the depths, and at the moment he enjoys them with a childlike sense of wonder, as shown through the no reflection, hinting that as of yet he's not getting that deeper meaning, but he's still enjoying the pleasure whilst he experiences it. Then we've got a shallow one. So this one's not deep, it's a different well, representing different experiences and how they can affect him in a different way, and giving him something different to work with. So we can see how this maps onto poetic inspiration and self-discovery. Then you've got the alliterative dry stone ditch, you've got any aquarium. Fructified just means made fruitful, and you've got that beautiful simile like any aquarium, which suggests that despite this well being a dry stone ditch, despite it being dry, it's still teeming with life and possibility, and this is something that overwhelms and awes Heaney. Then if we look at when you dragged, the verb suggests that the action is unsophisticated, foreshadowing the conflict of this activity with the composure of adulthood, because remember, you've got the self-reflective adult looking back on his childhood, and this kind of seems like this verb is at odds with that. Long roots becomes a symbol of family and tradition. You think roots, you think family tree, you think of the roots of where you came from. And it represents the art of remaining societal before he actually looks at himself. He needs to move them. So custom and tradition seem to be who he really is. Okay, or part of who he really is anyway. Again, really sensory imagery in soft mulch. Then you've got a white face hovered over the bottom. So not the sky as before. Now he is actually focusing on learning about himself. But it seems quite distanced there, a white face, that anonymity that comes with it. And he also directly addresses you as well. When you dragged out, so he involves the reader personally through that personal pronoun in the poem. And also, going back to that verb dragged, it also implies substantial labour in discovering something about himself, seeking poetic inspiration, and indicates that to find a reflection and what it represents, you have to work hard, like this laborious, this young boy who's completing this laborious task. And the reward is not always definitive. Then if you look at the next stanza, others had echoes. You've got assonance again recreating the echo of the well and revealing how vast it is. Gave you back your own call. Then if you look at a clean new music in it, we can see that there's personification and that there's metaphor. His source of inspiration has developed. So give you back your own call is a personification, and upon reflecting with this musical metaphor, we can see that Heaney gains clarity. Scarsome for there, out of ferns and tall foxgloves. You've got the repeated T sounds, and you've also got the fricative F sound. So the alliteration reflects that not all sources of inspiration will be pleasant and uplifting. He will reflect on negative ones too, and you know that's negative because the fricative sounds create a kind of almost aggressive tone there. The metaphor to depict how he found something inside himself that was distant is used in this stanza as well. Then you've got the rat slapping across my reflection. So again, some contextual information. Heaney had a childhood fear of rats growing up on his dad's farm, and we can see that being worked into the poem. So the literal image of self, the white face hovering over the bottom, has been ruined by the rat, this really unpleasant creature, slapping across, and you've got the sinister sibilants and the across as well, the sibilant sounds there, and the p sounds too, the plosive sounds. So quite a lot of consonants and sibilant sounds there, and the literal image of himself, literally and figuratively, as if he's pondering of the past, is interrupted, and the interruption shifts back to adult self, revealing the separation between adulthood and his young self. You can see the structural shift between the two stanzas because you've got this now, okay, that kind of time connective that lets you know you're entering rather abruptly back into the adult world. You can also note that there is a contemplative and introspective tone throughout as he's reflecting on his own internalised reasons for writing, but it's also quite pompous in parts, which clashes with the enthusiastic recollections of childhood adventure. So the adult ones are less enthusiastic and more pompous, probably reinforcing the divide between adulthood and childhood. So now to pry into roots to finger slime. So this takes on qualities of being inquisitive and curious. The use of the comma creates a slow pace, suggesting he is savouring the experience in a nostalgic way. You've got the repetition of to pry, to finger, with the caesura to move to the present tense from the past tense, which is really important as well. Then you've got the reference to Narcissus, reflecting the idea of self-love and vanity, and reinforcing that his aim is to look into himself directly in vanity. We can see that Narcissus was unable to reach his desire, so Heaney maybe feels that he is also unable to reach what his true desire was, like Narcissus, and Heaney must find a way of doing this. Then you've got the sibilant sounds of Sumspring, the alliteration of all adult dignity, and there's where that pompous, condescending tone comes in, beneath all adult dignity. The alliteration affirms that, like Frost, his rural childhood experiences were important in terms of sources for poetic inspiration, yet now, as a man, he must find something new, not as juvenile, and maybe that's poetry, so it's inspired by self-discovery. He continues two mediums of reflection, visual, which the visual end, which was separated in youth, suggests that poetry is effective, the self-inflection in Wells. Through poetry, we can see that he can learn about himself, as shown through the I rhyme, and this reflects on his life, gaining expression through writing and crafting a poem. Then, final line, to see myself, to set the darkness echoing. So again, it's self-reflective, he's learning something. He writes his poetry to look inwards on himself and his history, to bridge his childhood Wells with adult poetry, and he uses the image of Wells to show that he still has a hunger for depth that has inspired him to peer into the darkness of Wells, or peer into his own source of inspiration. So this is what he wants in his poetry, this darkness. First well is a thought not expressed into words, with the self-reflection symbolised by the well in stanza 3, his poetic inspiration. And the structure mimics that as he grows older through each stanza, he's able to see further and further into the wells. This idea that with adulthood comes more clarity, I suppose.